Thank you for joining me. I'm Gord Long. It's my pleasure to have with me again this month John Rubino. John is well recognized on the web, both as the publisher of the website of his website dollarcollapse.com and as a prolific writer. He's also the author of at least 2 books now. John, welcome.
Hey, Gord, 5 books.
I was going to say, as soon as I said that, I'm thinking of the last 2. It's 5 in total.
Yeah, two recent. Yeah, the Money Bubble's the most recent one, so we can plug that somewhere today, right?
Exactly. Prolific to say the least. I've got to make a comment. I see you almost every night on TV talking about silver going to $200 an ounce. I thought I was being aggressive.
Yeah. Yeah, sometimes the throwaway lines are the things that make it through the media filter, right? Yeah.
Isn't that always the
that
way?
Commercial, yeah.
You talk
that
for
commercial
30
seems to have
minutes.
had an impact.
You talk for 30 minutes, and the thing that they suddenly pull and focus is like, oh, I was being maybe a little aggressive there, but I'm with you. I really, when it break, the question is when. But I've had 55 and north fairly, not too far out, but 200. That's certainly aggressive. I hope you're right. I'll buy more silver.
Yeah, well, I mean, the basic math is that if gold goes to $5,000 an ounce, which isn't aggressive at all considering how much paper there is out there, and then the gold-silver ratio starts to trend back towards historically normal levels, then silver just erupts, and $200 an ounce becomes extremely conservative in that kind of a scenario. So that's the scenario in which the silver bugs are the next generation of rich people in the U.S. And you and I can be among them, right? If it works out.
Well, we got enough events going on, and we'll talk about them here today that could trigger some movements in any of the hard assets and precious metals. Let's start with Europe and France specifically. Our president was out at 3 o'clock in the morning twittering that he thinks that the shooting in Paris here yesterday could affect the French elections. For those that aren't watching them, we have the first round this Sunday. It's very, very close. Prime Minister Theresa May separately, as we all know, triggered Article 50, but she's called a snap election, and I think she was reacting somewhat to the Scottish Parliament wanting a second referendum because of Article 50. But a lot of these waves shorting through Europe. What do you think is going to happen? What do you think? What are you looking for in the next 6 months?
Yeah, well, the big picture answer to all this is that when you screw up your finances, your politics are screwed up by implication. And that's what the whole world is basically going through right now, but Europe in particular, because their system, as they set it up, the EU and the Eurozone, had some fatal flaws that were going to cause them trouble regardless. But the trouble is coming in the context of a troubled world. So that's magnifying what's going on in Europe. Now, the French election is really a big deal because there are 4 candidates who are all within spitting distance of qualifying for the runoff. They have an election, a first round election that narrows it down to 2, and then they have a runoff election between the 2 top vote getters for the presidency. And it's statistically completely possible right now that the runoff is between Marine Le Pen, who is quote unquote the far right candidate, who's anti-EU and anti-Euro, and a communist candidate who is also anti-austerity and anti-EU and anti-Euro. So it could be that as soon as the first round is done, France has a doomsday scenario to look at, where neither one of these candidates are part of the mainstream, and they're going to do really disruptive things if they get in. So the first round of voting is really the decisive round, because it almost doesn't matter whether you have Marine Le Pen or the other guy, and there's going to be extreme disruption going forward. Now, statistically, based on the polls...
This would be like in our election, we ended up with between Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump.
Yeah, it would be culturally like that. But
Similar.
This is something where the stakes are even higher, believe it or not, because the fate of the EU and the Eurozone hang in the balance. The US wouldn't dissolve if Bernie Sanders got elected, or it's not going to dissolve under Donald Trump probably. But the EU and the Eurozone could easily dissolve if France elects somebody who's opposed to those things, because France is central to the European project. If Britain could pull out without creating an existential threat for the European Union. and Britain wasn't part of the Eurozone to begin with, so no big deal there. But France is central. And if they were to pull out, the whole European project, as it now stands, would dissolve. And the EU is the biggest economic entity in the world. And there are trillions and trillions of dollars of euro-denominated bonds out there from Greece and Spain and Italy, who, if they went back to their old currencies, would do so with a massive devaluation. So those bonds would lose their value, and you'd have this global financial crisis because of that. And that's what this French election is leading us towards. You know, that's the potential downside of what could happen in the French election. So it's a very big deal. And they just had a terrorist attack a couple of days before the election, which always helps the far right. So that presumably gave Marine Le Pen, who's anti-immigration and pro-law and order, a little bump in the polls just when she needs it. Not that she was really going to have too much trouble getting into the runoff. You know, she was almost guaranteed going into this past week to be one of the top 2 vote getters. But it's possible now that she becomes the top vote getter and the communist guy sneaks in. So we'll see. You know, I before both Brexit and the U.S. presidential election, I went on interviews like this and said, you know, it's not going to happen. Neither one of those things are going to pass. Trump won't be president. Brexit won't pass. But the fact that they're in the running will make a big difference. But that was way too conservative. You know, those guys both won. And so I'm not going to say, oh, you won't see a runoff between a communist and a far-right candidate in France, because the last 2 big elections went that way. So this could easily happen. So we'll find out over the weekend how it plays out.
But it's definitely building, because, you know, in Holland, Wilder may not have won that election, but it was darn close. And so it's only, to me, the momentum is such that it's only a matter of time. If it's not this election, it's the next election. It just seems to be getting more anti-establishment, more anti-EU, more anti-immigration, really dissatisfied with the status quo in Europe. Clearly, now we have Germany this fall. That could be disruptive. Any comments there?
Yeah, Angela Merkel's party is losing ground in a lot of regional votes that they've held so far. So it's no guarantee that she stays in office. And if she leaves, the people who replace her, they're not going to be Marine Le Pen's probably in Germany, just because in general Germany's doing great. You know, there's less dissatisfaction in Germany because that's the successful economy in the EU and the Eurozone. But still, if she leaves, it's going to be people who aren't as sympathetic to the EU and to the Euro, and that's another level of disruption. Plus, you know, she's emerged as a world leader in part because she's so steady and so cautious, you know. So give Germany somebody who's less steady and less cautious, and that's almost it. You know, the rest of the world is kind of devolving into chaos, and now you'd have Germany as another wild card. So yeah, you know, as I said, when finance is screwed up, politics follows, and so trouble in France is virtually guaranteed one way or another, and trouble in Germany is a possibility because the global financial system is such a mess. We're taking on debt at a rate that is incredibly destructive. You know, it's frankly a huge surprise that we even got this far based on the numbers. We're grossly indebted pretty much everywhere you look, and the leverage in the global financial system is way higher than it was in 1929, for instance, before the global financial system basically collapsed. So if you include derivatives and unfunded liabilities, it's almost orders of magnitude more highly leveraged today than it was back then. So we've created the conditions for a huge financial crisis and really, you know, necessarily a monetary reset in which some of the major currencies out there either die or have to be devalued dramatically and then linked to some kind of a commodity standard again. You know, we've got to change the way the system works in a very dramatic way, and we won't get there. We won't get to the point where there's a consensus until we have a crisis. So that's all coming, and it's reflected day to day in politics, where every election is this shocking thing that couldn't have happened 10 years ago, and it's only going to get worse from here, because if the mainstream wins the next few elections, they can't fix anything because there's no consensus within the mainstream for radical change. So we'll get business as usual, which is bad news for most voters who, to the extent that they didn't vote for populist, out of the mainstream candidates this time around, they'll do it next time because they'll perceive that their needs haven't been addressed by the mainstream. So this has got legs, in other words. The political crisis is going to continue, and it's going to feed back into the financial crisis, which will in turn feed back into politics. So, and until some big crisis happens, like a major war, God forbid, or a huge financial crisis in one of the main countries in the world, we'll limp along like this, making things worse, digging the hole even deeper. And you and I will have a lot to talk about because every big election is going to be, similar to France's in one way or another, in the sense that outsiders are gaining power and they're promising to do extreme things, and voters seem to be embracing the message. Even if they don't win, an outsider coming in second is a political earthquake in a lot of countries, and we're going to see that everywhere going forward.
You mentioned, unless a war comes along, or let's call it a major geopolitical event. I want to start talking about some of those because they're boiling. Some of them are reaching a boiling point, or at least critical points. But before I do, just to comment on your comment about the growth of the debt, you had out an article with the International Finance Group and showing that the debt globally and against GDP, but it's up to $215 trillion. But what stunned me and was a surprise is the emerging markets have just prior to the dot-com were running about $7 trillion in total, are now at $55 trillion. And with their currency problems, most of their debt is denominated in US dollars, have been since we went to quantitative easing. There's huge problems there. And John, as big as that debt is, that's securities, 215 trillion. What everybody, I believe, forgets is contingent liabilities. And that's promises governments make that if something happens, they stand behind it. For example, if the United States guarantees Puerto Rican debt, they don't give the money, it's banked by the banks, but if they ever default, we come due. In the United States, we talk about our deficit at 20 trillion and unfunded liabilities at 84 trillion, but the real numbers are fiscal gap at 210 trillion. And as big, that's the contingent liabilities. And as big as that is, it's bigger in Europe. That's where I'm going here. I did a lot of work on that in terms of swaps, and I was stunned. So if it ever starts to weaken, what the point I'd make is the acceleration is phenomenal because the rate at which the deleveraging will have to happen. That's what, and it's this contingent liabilities that's so terrifying. So what would be the event? Well, we've got launching cruise missiles into Syria. We're dropping a Moab bomb in Afghanistan. We got a crackpot in North Korea, I'm being too harsh here, threatening with nuclear weapons. We got Tillerson talking real tough to Iran and real tough to Russia. I haven't seen this kind of tension in a long time. Comments on any of this and what it means?
Yeah, all of a sudden we're fighting with everybody, aren't we? And the problem, well, it's more than a problem. The huge risk of this kind of a situation is that accidents can happen. You've got people out in the field who have operational authority, who have decision-making authority, and let one aircraft carrier captain decide that something is coming his way that's a threat, and he responds to it and shoots down some Russian or Chinese planes or what he thinks is a missile or whatever, then you've got a shooting war between superpowers out there. And there are 3 or 4 places where that's completely possible without a policy decision in that direction. Just from the assets out there who are bumping up against each other, somebody making a mistake. And that's the kind of threat that we've created to the world right now, where whoever wins the initial or whoever loses the initial engagement feels like they have to save face and get back some of theirs, and so they escalate, and then we escalate, and it goes on like that until you're actually in a war for no reason. That's kind of how World War I got started. And now it's not like we have secret treaties or anything. It's just that we have military assets all over the place, right up next to the people who we could be fighting with, and we're too far away to make the decision to go or not go centrally. It could happen just because somebody in the theater decides that it's the right thing to do. So that's obviously a potential wild card for the financial markets. But you mentioned the emerging markets a minute ago, and that's another big deal because here's the emerging market doomsday scenario. Basically, some crisis happens somewhere in the world, and it terrifies everybody out there and sends them into treasury bonds because that's perceived to be the financial safe haven. Okay, so money pours out of China or Russia or Europe or wherever into treasuries, which push down interest rates in the US and push up the value of the dollar at the same time. Well, all the emerging market dollar denominated debt then becomes harder and harder to manage at a time when the global economy is being roiled by some kind of geopolitical or economic turmoil out there. And the emerging markets can't pay their bills. And so you start to see dominoes falling in Latin America and Asia and other places. And because that's an awful lot of debt now, 55 trillion, I think is what you said, a lot of it owed to big Western banks. Then we're back to the, something much worse than the 1990s, but something similar in structure where, Mexico defaulted and Russia defaulted, and the Fed had to come in and bail out those countries in order to bail out the big banks. Well, this is orders of magnitude bigger than that and more widespread than that. And it's, I won't say imminent, but it's one of those things that could easily happen. The scenario in which they have to deal with a much stronger dollar and some of them start to collapse is right there. It's something that could happen very easily and very logically from current conditions. So that's one catalyst. And Gord, when you start going through catalysts, things that could blow up the financial system, you've got a couple of hours of discussion right there just to cover them all, because there is so much out there that we've screwed up, frankly, where we've taken on too much debt or where we've made incredibly unwise political and geopolitical decisions that have left us with no upside and a huge amount of downside. The Middle East is obviously the biggest example of that, but look around the world. There are other places like that where it's almost inconceivable that we get out of it smoothly and easily in the next decade without some kind of crisis. So the stuff that can go wrong is multiplying at a time when our ability to deal with things going wrong is cratering. As we take on more and more debt, people think we're deleveraging right now, or that the amount of debt in the world has stopped increasing, but actually it's increasing at the fastest rate ever. China's government is running massive deficits. The US borrowed $1 trillion at just the central bank level or the central government level in 2016, and we're not slowing down. The European Central Bank is buying assets at the fastest pace ever. Or Zero Hedge just had an article showing that just in the first 3 months of this year, the world's central banks bought $1 trillion worth of assets. That's the fastest pace of debt monetization ever. So we aren't slowing down. It's exactly the opposite. We're increasing the amount of leverage that's in the system at an accelerating rate. So this has all the hallmarks of an incipient credit bubble bursting. Okay, and it's not clear when it bursts, but this has the feel of the parabolic blow-off phase of a credit bubble. This is 2006, 2007 all over again, or 1999, 2000, in terms of the rate of increase of leverage in the system. So only the Austrian School of Economics explains this. This is a crack-up boom, or this is the beginning of a crack-up boom, in which the system is being leveraged at such a dramatically increasing pace that people finally figure out that that's bad for the fiat currencies of the world, and they bail on those currencies. And that manifests as inflation turning into hyperinflation when all the asset prices that are being bid up by people getting out of their currency and into real assets start to show up and convince people that we've got inflation again, and then it spins out of control. So we, just based on the numbers, are heading for something like that. And the question then becomes, is that a 2018 story or something further out? And that's unknowable, but these numbers are insane, Gord. We never should have gotten to this point, and the fact that we're accelerating past this point into something even more serious is just astounding.
The other thing that's accelerating at the same time in parallel, and James Rickards talks about it all the time, is how fragile global financial system is and the level of complexity and what can go wrong will go wrong. And you talk about war, and they typically start unexpectedly by a mistake. Somebody, as you mentioned, First World War, somebody shot, and the next thing we had a war going, and that's not untypical. But this time it may not be a classic shooting war. I've been arguing for some time it'll be a cyber war, and it'll be where the economics, things shut down. Look at this recently in Korea, the missile that blew up last week, and all of a sudden the world is abuzz. It is because the United States has been hacking the missile launch system and able to shut it down. We don't know. But a while ago they were talking about the kinds of surveillance that was going on in the web through video cams and was shutting down traffic. We don't know the answers to this, but I do know I see Russia, what it's doing with its SWIFT system, etc. And the amount of people in cyber command in the U.S. government, over 20,000 and growing right now, just hacking or avoiding hacking or whatever they're doing. But the point I'm trying to get to is any kind of disruption in the economic financial system. Let's say ATMs were shut down for 3 days or 4 days. Do you understand, or the chaos that would ensue everywhere? And I'm just picking on ATMs. We can get into a lot of things that would be maybe as right. So when it gets this dangerous, even if something breaks, it's blamed, and then all of a sudden we're reacting to it. So it's and then the complexity and the fragility, very, very dangerous time. There's another level of problems going on here, John, and that is here at home in the United States, Trumponomics. Tax relief that's supposed to happen, regulatory reductions that are supposed to happen, stimulus spending that's supposed to happen, but we got congressional gridlock, or at least problems getting things through. We got a fiscal debt ceiling looming here next Friday, the April the 29th, and I'm not sure exactly how they're going to get through this one, or at what point. At the same time, I'm seeing signals in terms of a U.S. recession, and I look at tax receipts, and the federal and the state tax receipts are plummeting, and they've gone negative. Only time I've ever seen that is consistent. We're in a recession. I'm not calling a recession, but it's imminent. These are kinds of other problems here at home. Comments there?
Yeah, the economy does seem to be slowing down. You're right. The Atlanta Fed GDP Now report has first quarter GDP at 0.5% on an annual rate, which is way too low to stop the increase of debt to GDP. In other words, we're still over leveraging ourselves. We're leveraging ourselves at an increasing rate if the economy doesn't grow fast enough to offset the amount of debt that we're taking on. And 0.5% is nowhere near that fast. We need 3 or 4% to actually start lowering the amount of debt relative to GDP in the system. So that's a bad thing. And if the slowdown continues, that means all the debt that we took on in, for instance, 2016, when we really borrowed a lot of money, we're at the point where the marginal productivity of debt, in other words, the bang you get for each new buck of borrowed money, is rapidly approaching zero. And at that point, it's game over for this system. The fractional reserve banking, fiat currency, big government system, dominated by central banks, is over. And I'm not saying that's this year or next year, but we're trending in that direction if first quarter GDP growth is a sign of things to come. And it does seem to be, because a lot of the other numbers that have come out since have been really lackluster. So yeah, and in terms of Trump's policies, it's important to remember that we haven't passed anything yet. We're still operating on the system that was designed in the Bush/Obama era. And that required a huge amount of new debt year after year after year to be stable. If we have to borrow a couple of $1 trillion a year just to stay at this level, at a level that most people consider inadequate, then that's a profound failure, because you can't keep borrowing that much money year after year after year, because the debt builds up, and then you can never have interest rates go back to normal levels, because everybody who had taken on insane amounts of debt in the previous monetary and fiscal period of experimentation see their budgets get just totally blown up by the fact that their interest costs go through the roof. Most of the governments of the world have borrowed very short term because that's where interest rates were lowest. So that means they have to roll that debt over every few years. The US has to roll, for instance, $3 or $4 trillion a year of debt over each year. Well, let interest rates go up, and the cost of rolling that debt goes up year after year after year, and that blows up our budget. On the other hand, keep interest rates at this extremely low level around the world that they are now, and that incents everybody in the world to borrow more money, because if you assume that rates can never go up, and you can borrow money for, let's say, 1%, which most of the governments and a lot of corporations in the world can do, while currencies are being devalued at 2 or 3% a year, then it makes eminent sense to borrow as much money as possible. So the current system encourages an increase in debt at every level of society. So low interest rates, which were, in Keynesian theory, low interest rates allow you to grow fast enough to get out from under your debts. In other words, it leads GDP to go up faster than debt. And so you, in effect, deleverage over time. But if low interest rates actually lead people to borrow even more money and debt to GDP goes up, then you've defeated the purpose of your policy. And that's kind of where we are now. The old rationale for incredibly low interest rates is turning out to not only not work, but to give us the opposite outcome. And that outcome is extreme over leverage at every level of every major society, which is going to lead to a gigantic financial crisis. And we're seeing it now kick into high gear because interest rates remain low around the world. Debt is increasing at an accelerating rate, which means that year after year, the possibility of rising interest rates becomes more and more remote, which means it makes even more sense to borrow tons of money, which means, and so on. The interest rates can never go back up. And the only end to this process is a huge currency devaluation. That's somewhere out there. You've got to spring a surprise devaluation that's coordinated across all the major currencies to stop this process in its tracks. And so you can't announce it. It can't be, as the Keynesians would like right now, an announcement of a target of 4% inflation going forward, which makes no sense because then everybody in the world borrows money at 1 or 2% if they assume inflation is going to be 4% going forward. So that defeats the purpose of that policy. But the way you do it then, and the way it's done historically, is you wait till Sunday afternoon and you announce a major devaluation when the markets are closed and nobody can do anything about it. And so that's coming. Now, that's a part of the policy mix that we'll see somewhere out there in the not too distant future. And it'll come as a huge shock. By definition, it has to come as a huge shock to the markets, because if the markets know it's coming, then they'll front run it and they'll short circuit it. But if they don't know it's coming, then it has a chance of succeeding. That's Jim Rickards' scenario, when everybody gets together and goes back to the gold standard at $10,000 an ounce, which is the same thing as defining the dollar going forward as 1/10,000th of an ounce of gold and making them convertible. You can always cash in your dollars for gold. You can always cash in your gold for dollars, and that limits the growth of the money supply going forward. We got that out there somewhere, if we survive the coming geopolitical crises, that's a good thing for people who own real assets and a terrible thing for people who don't. If you've got a bank account because you trust the government to maintain the value of the dollar and you've got your savings in dollars, you suffer big time from that kind of a surprise. On that Sunday night when the massive devaluation of the dollar is announced, your net worth goes down by 70%. So all of a sudden, that lifetime of savings that you put together so that you could retire comfortably and your kids wouldn't have to take care of you and blah, 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 on and on, that evaporates because you trusted the government. So that's the really despicable part of current policy, because it's leading us to that point where that's the only solution that's left. And rich people benefit, as they always do, from it because they own the real assets, and regular working people who trust the government and own financial assets are hurt by it. So it's just a sudden version of the ongoing process that we've been seeing for the last 10 years.
Ben Bernanke, when he was chairman and talking about devaluation of currencies, he had a doctrine he published, and he called it enrich thy neighbor. Not beggar thy neighbor, which is the problem the last time we started debasing currencies, but enrich thy neighbor is when 95% of the world's currencies that are traded are four currencies, which I refer to as a currency cartel, are the pound, the euro, the dollar, and the yen. And if Bernanke's argument is if we devalue in a, I'll use not his words, but a ring around the rosy, take turns at devaluing, it's hard to see where the devaluation's happening because there's no other place to take your money. Typically, the answer is, well, that gold goes through the roof, silver goes through the roof. But if they're manipulated, and there's a lot of facts that would suggest they are highly manipulated, where do you go? Russian ruble, the Indians' currency, Brazil's, China. By the way, all the ones that are out of that are buying gold. So, but how long? That game has been going on for a while, and it starts to run out of problems. And you saw they're even increasing the currency here. Our rate, as you just said, liquidity of $1 trillion here in the first quarter of this year, which is frightening. But John, the bigger problem with this whole Keynesian philosophy, and to springboard from what you said, when you do quantitative easing for a sustained period of time, it's about bringing demand forward. Well, let's assume we brought all that demand forward. Doesn't that create a hole in the other side for demand where it slows down? But I wouldn't even argue that. The bigger issue is not the demand, it creates supply. Cheap money has produced so much, all that $55 trillion we talked about in emerging markets, it went into creating supply, whether products, whether materials, mining, whatever. We have so much supply now, and you know what that leads to? Deflation. That's what, because all of a sudden you have not lack of price discovery, you have no pricing power, and that's, I'm misstating a lot of things that are fairly obvious, but it's been going on for so long. These are the cracks that are really showing every way where we look. We didn't mention corporations right now and their cash flows that are falling. They've been doing buybacks. Now they're borrowing money to pay the interest. But you wrote about in China, the leverage that's going on in the dairy industry, that's going on in the aluminum industry, and the cracks that it's showing. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, well, China 10 or so years ago decided to build out their infrastructure and increase their capacity in basic industry. So they borrowed basically more money than any country has ever borrowed in human history. That even more than the US did post 2008, 2009. And they basically built a steel industry from almost scratch, a cement industry, and on down the line. They build up, globally dominant players in all these basic industries. What they, I think, didn't figure on was that the global marketplace couldn't accommodate all that new supply. China produced more cement in 1 3-year period recently than the US had produced in the previous 100 years. That's an incredible amount of cement because we produced a lot. The US did.
And now they got the capacity and they need to sustain it. Therein lies the problem.
They've ramped up, they've got all these people hired and everything, but the rest of the world can't handle all the cement and all the steel, et cetera, that they're producing because it would wipe out the domestic industries in every other country. So we're putting up trade barriers and just basically not taking their stuff anymore. And that is leading a lot of these big Chinese, globally dominant Chinese companies to have cash flow problems. And a couple of them just failed lately. One of them was one of the biggest dairy operations in the world, which was defined as too big to fail and is being bailed out by the government. And the other is the biggest aluminum producer in the world, which just collapsed lately under a cloud of accounting fraud because they were basically hiding the fact that their cash flow was nowhere near what they were saying. And they're talking about massive civil unrest unless the government bails them out. So China is at the beginning stages of a currency crisis in which they have no choice but to create a huge amount of new currency to bail out all these zombie companies that they created really unwisely over the past 10 years, which means their debt has to go through the roof from here after it's already gone through the roof at a completely unsustainable pace to give them a debt to GDP ratio that is off the charts for a developing country. They're not a developed country yet. They're not Germany, but they've got more debt than Germany. So it's not clear how China gets out from under this either, other than massive devaluation. So the enrich thy neighbor policy that Ben Bernanke likes has that fatal flaw in it, is that eventually people figure out that that's the policy. And then it makes no sense to hold any of these fiat currencies. So yeah, your question of where the money goes is really well placed, because lately it's been flowing into equities worldwide. In other words, a rock solid global company is a safer place to be than any individual country who's devaluing their currency. So the stock markets of the world are up. And a lot of hot real estate sectors are going through the roof. You know, you've seen what happened in Toronto, not far from you, Toronto, Canada, just lately, where their real estate prices went up by 30% in a year. And they just imposed a tax on foreign buyers of real estate in their market, trying to staunch the flow of hot money, which may or may not work. You know, trying to stop hot money inflows has been kind of a losing game for developing countries and for small countries in general in the past couple of decades, because it's just overwhelming. You know, there's way more money in China wanting to get into Canada than there is money in Canada, you know, and so there's a mismatch between size here. And
John, it's so out of control in Toronto. My brother here just a couple months ago sold one of his properties in Toronto. He had 11 bidders going on in the night. He demanded cash, not financing on it. Two or three of them were from China. They literally overnight were wiring back and forth from China to have the cash for him to do the settlement on the deal. My brother is, I will say, is still partying on what he got from it. Because it was even the price was so much higher than he listed it at, because of the bidding war that ensued. It's crazy. Now they went to the some of the changes the taxes are now putting in place in Toronto to stop it. I saw it on the West Coast in Vancouver when I was out there a while ago. The craziness of friends of mine that were living in Vancouver. But you know, John, just in closing here. You know, that this leveraging is even the United States. We're so leveraged in retail, and I'm seeing store closings, some are upwards of 10,000 anticipated this year, which is affecting, you know, when you roll over the debt and the store values or this property, the residential, because retail is a high rent offering, if it's falling, the values of the buildings fall, and therefore you have to raise more collateral. I'm seeing it in the automotive industry that's beginning to slow down, and some of the leverage that's happening there. So I'm seeing a lot of these corporations that have highly leveraged themselves have now got real problems with some of the collateral values that are underneath it, and as the credit is starting to tighten, at least in some of the lending side of it, even though the government, I think that's why they're pushing out more liquidity. We have to wrap here, John, but any comments on what I just said? And I know you were just finishing another point.
Yeah, well, the real estate thing is interesting, because that hasn't been the epicenter of this bubble.
No.
You know, it was last time around, but it's getting back to that. We just had a home sales number come out this morning that was at 2007 levels. In other words, home sales are starting to boom. And I've got a good friend here who's a real estate appraiser who's saying, out here in Idaho, which is not normally a real estate bubble region, he's seeing lots of offers above the lots of offers above the original asking price on houses, which is extremely rare out here, but it's a sign that we're going parabolic out here too. So that money that's being created has to go somewhere. And it's starting to flow into real assets again. In other words, people are buying real estate because they assume that that's going to do better than financial assets. And gold and silver are always part of that mix. Even when the governments of the world try to manipulate their prices lower and try to, stop the increase, they always fail in the end, because the amount of money that's sloshing around out there that really doesn't care what governments think is overwhelming. And so if the hot money of the world decides that, well, Toronto's not that attractive as a real estate market anymore, I've already got my Miami condo, what else can I get? Well, let's store some gold and silver in a Swiss bank account or something like that. Then just a tiny fraction of that hot money would send precious metals through the roof. And that's also a 2018 story, maybe. That's something that's going to happen along the way as this thing progresses. So I think precious metals will be something that is headline news at some point in the not too distant future. We don't know when exactly, but it's certainly setting up for a precious metals bull market that equals what happened in the past 7 or 8 years after the Great Recession got going, at least, and maybe rivals what happened in the 1970s.
You know, the real estate was our last crisis. This one could be in commercial real estate, specifically in retail sides of it. But you know, you're valid in terms of housing, but a lot of that's real, as you also point in Toronto and Vancouver, foreign money fleeing China. Not just China, fleeing various areas that they're very concerned about. And the perception is at least the U.S. Dollar may be safer, or U.S. assets may be safer. But the underlying, it isn't that they're of that value, it's that they're fleeing from problems. The money that's trying to get out of China, you can see it in Bitcoin. I mean, it's more expensive than gold, because it's a way of capital flight that's going on. And it's not just unique to China. There are all sorts of places around the world that are not getting headlines right now, that their people are terrified and are looking for safe havens. And any of these geopolitical events we just talked about, these elections, all they're creating is instability and unrest, and people don't know where to go with their money right now. And these are why some of these bubbles start to appear out of nowhere historically. Closing comments, John, as we wrap?
Yeah. Well, just I'll finish up a little bit with the commercial real estate thing, Gord, because that is interesting. Because we built in the U.S. more retail space per person than almost anywhere else in the world. You know, we have vastly more stores than, for instance, Europe does per capita. And now we've got a technological problem.
50 square feet per person, compared to the closest to us is 18 in the UK and Canada,
Yeah.
and it's usually 2. Mall, and so we have 1,200 malls, and the consultants say we're going down to 310 to 400 will close. We've built so much capacity on a 70% consumption economy. Just a slowdown in consumption of tapped out middle is absolutely crushing. Look at the store closings that we're seeing, John. They're just every chain. Payless the other day. I mean, it just goes on and on.
Yeah. Well, we overbuilt, which is one problem, and then we have a technological transition which is exacerbating the overbuilding, because it doesn't make sense to go to the mall anymore. You know, online shopping is so easy. The UPS guy and I have this running joke where he brings the day's 2 or 3 packages to our house and says, "Your wife is working me too hard," you know, because we buy pretty much everything online anymore except for groceries. And I think that's not unique. You know, most people are starting to make that transition, especially younger people who assume that that's how you buy stuff.
We have 77 million millennials under the age of 34. That's all they do. They don't think of going to the mall. It's faster, cheaper, and they don't have the time. It's just we need to recognize it isn't just the internet. We've got a whole generation that grew up on social media, and they're now becoming the driving force in our economy. We've reached critical mass. That's why Amazon's going crazy. So the point back to here is, it's not to criticize the overcapacity in bricks and mortar and retail. It's a reality of a new world, and all of this is so heavily leveraged when we did all this big build out. That's why I'm really worried about commercial retail space.
Gord, next time we talk, give us your favorite REIT short candidates, okay? I'm ready to jump into that. Yeah.
And that's a good point, because the REITs have been the place that everybody that's been chasing yield have went to, and that's where the pension plans and the insurance companies have loaded up, because the stable thing, and the small banks, where the stable thing to be in has been commercial real estate. I'm not talking about a bust in commercial real estate, John, but you know, it's so large at 13 trillion in the United States. Even a small adjustment of 5 and 6% on the leverage is a big problem. And you know, it's not like the housing crisis that we had. It's just a minor kinds of adjustment on pricing that could bring this in. And it's just, again, it's an example more of the amount of leverage that's out there.
Why aren't you talking about a bust? It seems like a bust is inevitable in commercial real estate. Aren't malls going to die off, like let's say 50% to 75% of them in the next decade? And
the big box stores that are out there that have exploded, and the various types of the standalone REITs. If you look at the malls, for example, John, all the corner anchor stores, J.C. Penney's, Macy's, Sears, we all know the problems that they've had, and because the department store model is broken. But the issue is all the people that built companies built their retail on the mall traffic. So if you go through Ralph Lauren, American Eagle Outfitters, Abercrombie and Fitch, and just keeps on going, their total business plan is based on stores in the malls. What happens when the traffic drives? They go online. Pretty tough at a $70 share to sustain it, isn't it?
Oh yeah.
So
yeah,
and that
it's not clear how
process.
these guys
So,
survive.
and I'm just giving. I didn't mean to pick on them, those particular ones. I just came to mind. But this is the kind of change that we're in the middle of. And the problem is we're in a fragile economic system that's so over leveraged. It could be something we're talking about here could trigger it, right? We talked about what could be in Russia. It could be a geopolitical event. It could be a cyber attack. This is a very incredibly dangerous time. Anyway, I didn't mean to get on here, John. Spending a lot of time on
there's suddenly there's even more than usual to talk about, isn't it?
There is. John, can you tell our listeners where they can follow all your great writings on your site?
Sure. I run dollarcollapse.com that covers a lot of the stuff we talked about. And my most recent book is co-written with Gold Money's James Turk called The Money Bubble. It's also available on Dollar Collapse or Amazon.com.
Always lots to talk about, John, and every time we get talking, there's something else that triggers the discussion. So I'll talk to you again next month.
Great.
Talk to
Thanks,
you.
Gord.
Bye.